Do you ever worry about the next generation? You ever find yourself looking at them from time to time, maybe just shaking your head because of what they're doing? Like, what are you doing? Why? You might find yourself doing that from time to time as we read or hear or see stories about them. Like the teenage girl who got stuck in a storm drain because she dropped her precious iPhone down it and had to try to recover it. Or the teenage boy that got attacked by squirrels trying to take a selfie with them to show off to all his friends. Or the group of them that were standing around a rotary phone for, it seemed like hours, trying to figure out how to use this thing. Or why in the world would they entertain themselves by taking Scotch tape and taping it around their faces in a way that contorts them to look like this? Like, why? What are you doing? Do you ever look at them and wonder who's going to lead them? You ever wonder who's going to lead the generation that's coming next? In England, some people are asking that same question. Over their next future king, little Prince George. He's 5. A recent article in their papers was entitled 14 times, okay, not twice, not 5, not 10, 14 times Prince George took a temper tantrum. That was the title of the article. And even his own mom, Princess Kate, says that, from time to time, they don't let little Prince George travel with them because he's just too naughty. Or there was that time, just very shortly ago, when the social media world just blew up because there was a picture of Prince George at his Uncle Harry's wedding picking his nose. And they look at this little boy, 5, and they say, he's going to be our next king? He's going to be the one that is going to lead next? And so there might be some concern. And we ask ourselves the question, who is going to lead the next generation? That can be very easy to miss. Are you missing it? Are we missing it? Because if you're looking at them, you are. Because all of us this morning have to look no further than themselves. God has placed us, each of us, into the lives of the generation who will be next. We have an incredible opportunity, and I would say responsibility, in whatever capacities we live in with these next generation as fathers, mothers, aunts, uncles, friends, older siblings, whatever it is. God's looking at us, and he's asking that same question. Who will lead them? Who will lead the generation that's next? And so maybe we should be concerned for other reasons. Because when we look at them, there is concern. I recognize that. An article I read back in September was entitled, The 10 Most Significant Challenges That the Next Generation is going to Face. And they included things like substance abuse, body image issues, negative stereotyping, and significant family problems. And that's 4 of the 10. And as I read the 10, I was thinking there's more that I could probably add to this. And one of the most significant ones to me, not in this article, for reasons, one of the most significant ones for me was the constant attack for our children to live, the next generation to live, with a biblical worldview. Because God has a high standard for things like morality and life and truth. And all of those things today are being literally crushed in the lives of the next generation. So the question is, how are they going to make it without us? How are they going to make it without us? Without our support, and without our encouragement, and without our direction in their lives to live godly lives in the way that God would desire. How will the next generation be led godly if so much seems against that? So there should be some concern. I mean, look no further than ourselves. Our text today, second last sermon in this series called The Living Edge. And our text today is going to ask that question. How will the next generation be led godly when there's so much that seems against it? And we're going to get that right off the start in 2 Kings chapter 11, verse 1. If you can turn there with me, we're going to just follow this through. We're going to cover 2 chapters today. Don't worry. We're going to zip through it. 2 Kings chapter 11, verse 1. When Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she proceeded to destroy the whole royal family. Now, who is Athaliah? Athaliah is the daughter of probably the most wicked, evil, ungodly, unholy couple that the nation of Israel saw. King Ahab and his queen Jezebel. And she certainly lived up to her mom and dad's low view of God and his ways. And her son, who was the king, Ahaziah, had just been killed. Why was he killed? Because it wasn't just him, it was the whole generation of men. Why? Well, that was our sermon last week, and so I'll just preface it with just one line. A righteous God was bringing justice to an unrighteous leadership. That's what was happening. See, these kings and this generation of men were unfit to lead God's kingdom. Okay, they were unfit. And so they all get taken out. And now this Athaliah thinks that she has a chance. Now maybe she can take power. That's what she's really after. Now maybe she can take power, but there's a problem. The problem is that she's a woman. And the reason that's a problem is because while one generation of male descendants was completely wiped out, there is still her grandsons. And her grandsons are the rightful heirs to the throne. And so what does she decide? I'm going to kill my grandsons. I'm going to kill them. Athaliah is a psychopath. I don't know how else to say it. She's a psychopath. In fact, she could probably be the subject of some pretty horrific horror movies today, if they're looking for a star. If she was alive today, probably Netflix would follow her around for a couple of years, taking videos, so that we can all look on our screens safely at this horror of this woman, this evil woman, to try to figure out what could make this woman tick. How will the next generation be led godly? Well, there might not even be one. Because the generation that's coming next, she wants to kill. Even though they're her own grandsons. We'll look at verse 2. But, okay, there's a good word. Something's going to change now. But Jehosheba, the daughter of King Jehoram, and sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the royal princes who were about to be murdered. She put him and his nurse in a bedroom to hide him from Athaliah, so he was not killed. Jehosheba, this godly, beautiful woman, steps in. She's the sister of the dead king and the aunt to this little 1-year-old toddler boy named Joash. And her husband, the high priest, Jehoiada, step in to protect him. A godly next generation will be led by a godly generation now. And a godly generation now sees them in light of God's plans. Jehosheba and Jehoiada saw little Joash in light of God's plans. 2 Samuel 7:16 promised them that God would have an heir to the crown, a king from this family line that we know eventually would be the line where Jesus Christ comes from. But that wouldn't happen if that line was cut off, like Athaliah was attempting to do. And so Jehosheba and her husband Jehoiada see this little bundle, Joash, in light of God's plan. And seeing the next generation in light of God's plan means protecting them from evil. If we're going to see them in light of God's plan, we've got to protect them from evil. And so Jehosheba and Jehoiada step up to do this, along with a nurse. And we never hear her name. She doesn't even get much airplay. She's a hero of the story as well. She steps up to protect this little 1-year-old boy. Seeing them in light of God's plans means protecting them from evil. It means building in them a fear of the Lord, the proper reverence for God. Look at verse 3. He remained hidden with his nurse at the temple of the Lord for 6 years, while Athaliah ruled the land. He was at this temple, and who was the high priest of the temple? His uncle, Jehoiada, a devoted man of God, who certainly Joash, growing up in that surroundings, would have had that attitude and that reverence for God passed on to him. And they're going to build that in him. They're going to build that proper fear of the Lord. And seeing them in light of God's plan means surrounding them with trustworthy people. Look at verse 4 down to verse 11. In the 7th year, Jehoiada, okay, there's uncle, sent for the commanders of units of 100, the Kerites and the guards, and had them brought to him at the temple of the Lord. He made a covenant with them and put them under oath at the temple of the Lord. Then he showed them the king's son. This is 6 years later. He commanded them, saying, "This is what you are to do. You who are in the 3 companies that are going on duty on the Sabbath, a third of you guarding the royal palace, a third at the sewer gate, and a third at the gate behind the guard who takes turns guarding the temple. And you who are in the other 2 companies that normally go off Sabbath duty are all to guard the temple for the king." He's saying no one gets a day off today. Verse 8, "Station yourselves around the king, each of you with weapon in hand. Anyone who approaches your ranks is to be put to death. Stay close to the king wherever he goes." The commanders of units of 100 did just as Jehoiada the priest ordered. Each one took his men, those who were going on duty on the Sabbath and those who were going off duty, and came to Jehoiada the priest. Then he gave the commanders the spears and shields that had belonged to King David and that were in the temple of the Lord. The guards, each with weapon in hand, stationed themselves around the king near the altar and the temple, from the south side to the north side of the temple. The high priest, Jehoiada, knows who he can trust. The commanders of 100, there was a number of those guys. The Kerites, they're like personal bodyguards. And the guards. He knew these men were not loyal to this evil queen Athaliah. And 6 years later, when the whole land thought all hope was gone and they're going to have to live under this rule for a long time, Jehoiada takes these men and reveals, 6 years later, the rightful heir to the throne. And how do you think they felt at that moment? They would have been ecstatic. They would have been absolutely ecstatic and also very aware that they all had a job to do, to surround this boy, to get him to where God needed him to be. And so that's what they did. They all surrounded a 7-year-old boy who would be king. A godly next generation will be led by a godly generation now. And a godly generation now sees them in light of God's plan, and they celebrate their place in God's kingdom. Look at verse 12. Just think of a 7-year-old boy experiencing this. Jehoiada brought out the king's son and put the crown on him. He presented him with a copy of the covenant and proclaimed him king. They anointed him, and the people clapped their hands and shouted, "Long live the king!" To celebrate their place in God's kingdom, it meant something personally meaningful. I mean, look at this 7-year-old boy. Here's a 7-year-old boy who gets crowned with this amazing crown. It gets put on his head. Imagine how big his eyes would have got. Just that moment filled with the wonder of a child. It would have been personally meaningful. It was also personally demanding. Because not only did he get a crown, he got a copy of the covenant. See, more awesome than the crown was the responsibility that came with that crown. A responsibility to lead these people as a 7-year-old boy in God's ways. And don't think that was lost on him. It wouldn't have been lost on him even at 7. And it certainly was not lost on Jehoiada, the uncle, on Jehosheba, the aunt, and all these people that surrounded him. They believed in him, but they knew they would have to stay next to him to get him there. Personally demanding, but also very much personally affirming. And they anointed him, and they clapped their hands, and they shouted, "Long live the king." 7 years old. I wonder if he blushed. There he is on a platform with all the people surrounding him, and all these things happening. I wonder if he blushed. I wonder if he got goosebumps. What a meaningful, demanding, affirming celebration. Not much like the celebrations we have. Our celebrations tend to look back. This celebration looked ahead. When I think of our celebrations, I was at a restaurant last night with some friends, some missionary friends from Toronto, and whenever there was a birthday in the house, they would crank up this music, and the person would put a sombrero on their head, and they sing this little tune, and then it would be over. Or maybe like, I've seen it at Montana's, where you go for breakfast at Montana's, and then what do? Okay, they stand you on a chair, put moose antlers on your head, and give you a sparkler. It's like, it's not even close to what Joash was experiencing. See, a lot of those celebrations look behind, but this one looks ahead. Think about our celebrations. Hey, a lot of them are for what's already happened. All right, he turned 7. You got here. You got to 7. All right, you made it to double digits. You got to 10. Okay, you got to sweet 16, and we celebrate that someone got to 16. Or they got to 30, and you got to 30 again. Well, there's your 30 for the 10th time. Okay, we celebrate what happened. Okay, we don't want to look ahead. We celebrate someone's retirement. Look what they did. Or someone's graduation. Look what they've accomplished. This celebration is nothing like that. This celebration looks ahead. And as much as they're obviously honoring that this boy had arrived alive, it's more about what God's going to do in the next dozens and dozens of years under his leadership. It looks ahead. It's very much a huge difference in how we celebrate things. In fact, something for us to think about. How we can celebrate differently and more effectively. But they're celebrating what God is going to do. Because a godly next generation will be led by a godly generation now. And the godly generation now celebrates their place in God's kingdom. Okay, where they're going to go. and they also reinforce God's high standards. They definitely do that. Sometimes I think that with our next generation, we just lower the bar too low. Let's not make them uncomfortable. Let's move the bar down here. I mean, they're millennials. So they're lazy, if that's what they're told. And they're entitled. And they want to be comfortable. So let's not get too high. Let's lower the bar. Let's give everyone a medal. Let's just get it real low. I think sometimes we do that. And then when we raise the bar, we raise the bar for things that aren't ultimately the most important things. And so why wouldn't we raise the bar on this one? I mean, if we're going to get something right, if we're going to raise the bar high, why would we do the next generation a disservice by not raising God's standards in their life? Reinforcing that. This is a key aspect that we see happening in the life of Joash. Okay, they raised this bar for him. And God's standards being reinforced in Joash's life means that they're going to show him what it means to purge evil. They're going to purge evil. Look at verse 13. When Athaliah heard the noise made by the guards and the people, she went to the people at the temple of the Lord. She looked, and there was the king, standing by his pillar, as the custom was. The officers and the trumpeters were beside the king, and all the people of the land were rejoicing and blowing trumpets. Then Athaliah tore her robes and called out, "Treason, treason!" It wasn't treason. She believed lies. Jehoiada the priest ordered the commanders of units of 100 who were in charge of the troops, "Bring her out between the ranks and put to the sword anyone who follows her." For the priest had said she must not be put to death in the temple of the Lord. So they seized her as she reached the place where the horses entered the palace grounds, and there she was put to death. Look at the last part of verse 18. There's more going on here. They smashed the altars and idols to pieces and killed Mattan, the priest of Baal, in front of the altars. They're going to purge evil. They're going to reinforce God's high standard. And here's kind of the lesson in that. Anything that's out to destroy you, anything that is out to destroy who you are in Christ, your relationship with God, must be dealt with. And it must be dealt with seriously and with finality. It's got to be done. And the next generation might need help seeing some of these things. Joash was 7. He probably didn't know all these dynamics. So they might need help seeing some of these things that are only going to destroy their life and where God sees them. Media and violence. That's desensitized our kids to things that they should be sensitive to. Issues of life and death. Culture has torn down the walls that are put boundaries around areas that shouldn't be torn down. In fact, the wall should be built up high and strong with extra locks on the door in areas such as sexuality. These are areas that can very much destroy our kids. And that's only 2 examples that are probably pretty blatant, but there's a lot more. And these people are going to help Joash purge those things from his life. They need to reinforce that. They're going to reinforce God's standards by purging evil. They're going to reinforce God's standards by having him pursue righteousness. Look at verse 17. Jehoiada then made a covenant. This is key. Between the Lord and the king and the people. that they would be the Lord's people. He also made a covenant between the king and the people. All the people of the land went to the temple of Baal and tore it down. They smashed the altars and idols. 2 covenants are being made. One of them is between God and his king and country. And the covenant was the people agreeing, yeah, we're going to follow God, like our grandfathers and their grandfathers had agreed to. We're going to follow him. We're going to pursue him. That's the first covenant. The second covenant is between king and country. And that covenant was this little boy Joash saying, yes, I will do my part to lead people in God's ways. And then all the people agreeing to let him. And then in one act of unity and devotion, they go to the place where people worship Baal, and they completely smash and demolish anything and everything that had to do with that. They smashed these idols. What's an idol? If we were to define what an idol was for us today, what would it be? How would you define that? I would say an idol is anything that replaces God in your life as the first priority. And so an idol is anything that you would rearrange your schedule around to make sure that of all things, you're not going to miss that. So what's it for you? What's your idol? What's that one thing that you're going to rearrange everything around so that you don't miss it? Well, these people went in home and smashed those things. They completely took care of them. So the question for you is, what would be the cost to you to do that? What would the cost for you today to go home and do that? Would it be worth it? And if you're thinking right now that it might not be worth it because the cost is too high, then that definitely is an idol. And you need to go home and put it in its proper place. You can still have some of those things, but not up here. Prioritize them properly, under God's direction. That's what these people did. And they showed it in a very significant way. I think maybe some idols we do have to literally smash. I've encouraged people to smash their computers. And there could be other things that might just need to have that kind of vigilance because it's just going to keep going south. So they pursue righteousness. They reinforce God's standard by pursuing righteousness, and they do it by persisting in watchfulness. Last part of verse 18, then Jehoiada the priest posted guards at the temple of the Lord. He took with him the commanders of hundreds, the Kerites, the guards, and all the people of the land, and together they brought the king down from the temple of the Lord and went into the palace, entering by way of the gate of the guards. The king then took his place on the royal throne. All the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was calm, because Athaliah had been slain with the sword at the palace. Joash was 7 years old when he began to reign. 7 years old. And they knew that as much as they guarded him on the day of his crowning, that wasn't going to stop anytime soon. They had to persist in watchfulness. And so those people in his life, in various capacities, uncle, aunt, bodyguards, they continued to watch out for the boy. A godly next generation will be led by a godly generation now. And a godly generation now will reinforce God's standards. And one more thing. they will also pray that God's work is seen in their life. That's the focus of chapter 12. I'm not going to go through every verse to verse. But to see God's work in their life, it means praying that they will build something that points to Him. Look at verse 5. This is very early in little Joash's reign. And he says that every priest receive the money from one of the treasurers, then use it to repair whatever damage is found in the temple. So Joash wants the temple of the Lord that signifies His presence, where people are pointed His way. Okay, that's his one thing. Okay, I want this done. He wants to make sure that this is updated and upgraded and fixed so that people can be pointed in God's direction. That's what he does. And no matter what the next generation does, whether they're teachers, whether they stay at home to be great moms, whether they get jobs, whether they travel, become doctors, whatever they do, we need to be praying that in whatever they do, they use it to point other people to Jesus. We need to be praying for that. We need to be praying that they deal with people graciously. That's a phenomenal leadership quality that is going south. We need gracious leaders. And in verse 6 to 10 in chapter 12, what happens is 23 years later, nothing's happened to the temple. No one's done anything. And so he graciously deals with the priests for their lack of energy and work towards this. He deals with them graciously, and then he comes up with a plan that everyone can agree to, that everyone is happy with, and they move forward to get that job done. He deals with people graciously. So to see God's work in their life, we've got to pray for these things, that they would build something that points to God, that they would deal with people graciously, and that they will, most of all, the highest thing is that they will honor God wholeheartedly. Verse 17 in chapter 12. About this time, Hazael, king of Aram, went up and attacked Gath and captured it. Then he turned to attack Jerusalem. But Joash, king of Judah, took all the sacred objects dedicated by his predecessors, Jehoshaphat, Jehoram, Ahaziah, the kings of Judah, and the gifts he himself had dedicated, and all the gold found in the treasuries of the temple of the Lord and of the royal palace. And he sent them to Hazael, king of Aram, who then withdrew from Jerusalem. Things don't end well for Joash. He started well. He did not finish well. Jehoiada, his uncle, really his father figure, he was beside him all these years, guiding him, directing him. He's died now. And with Jehoiada gone, his mentor, he quickly turns his heart away from God and begins to follow his own direction. Ephesians 6:6 says, "Do God's will with all your heart. Serve Him wholeheartedly, as if you are serving the Lord, not people." Joash never got there. Joash was all about the guidance. He needed it. But as soon as it was gone, he did his own thing. He never honored God wholeheartedly. And then he does this. We don't read it in this story. But in the parallel in 2 Chronicles, we hear of his stepbrother, Zechariah. Zechariah, after his father Jehoiada passes away, he becomes high priest. And he's a small blip on the screen. I mean, in this book, they don't even talk about him. He's behind the scenes, mostly unknown. But he comes into the story. And he goes to his kid brother, Joash, and he begins to rebuke him And he rebukes him for his heart and for what he's doing and for not just turning away from God, but because of the covenant, all the people following him away from God. And he begins to rebuke Joash. Zechariah honors God wholeheartedly. And for that, Joash has him killed. Joash didn't finish well. Zechariah, this character that we almost missed, finishes well. He actually proves to be the leader that the next generation thought Joash would be, but wasn't. And we almost missed him. We almost missed him. I'm sure Jehoiada would have raised those two boys exactly the same. Yet at the end of the day, there was only one that honored God wholeheartedly, who finished well as the leader God needed. Well, 50 years ago, there was a phenomenal evangelist. In his denomination, this was kind of in the days of Billy Graham, when Billy Graham was very popular, traveling, doing a lot of speaking to mass audiences. And there was an evangelist very much like Billy Graham who would travel like him within his denomination of churches, the people that knew him. And he would do these revival services. And God used him so powerfully that his schedule was booking 4 years out. And what he would do is he would travel for 2 weeks and come home for 2 weeks. And he'd go for 2 weeks, come home for 2 weeks. And that was going pretty well. But his wife was getting a little bit tired of that because their son, the next generation, was having some struggles with that and acting out because of that. And so one day when this evangelist was out at a church preaching, his wife calls him. I don't know how far away from home he was. And just says, I need you. So what's he going to do? He's a pretty important guy. He's booked 4 years out, got lots of travel, lots of work. And in that moment, he knew he had a choice to make. The choice was to cancel all 4 years of bookings. Go home, sell his house, move to another city, and buy a little tiny bungalow to serve a tiny little church for 2 years. 2 years just to get his son's feet back under him, to do the things that we talked about, and then he would be able to go and continue being an evangelist. What happened was 4 years later, the denomination had some challenges. A lot of pastors moved on. The new blood didn't know who he was. And that ministry was gone. Why did he do it? For the next generation. See, he saw them in view, he saw his son in view of God's plans. Not his wife's, not his coaches, not his teachers. God's plans. He could celebrate his place in God's kingdom at home, not away. He could reinforce God's standard in his life by being there and modeling those things. And he could just pray that God's work would be seen in this boy's life. Well, that boy was James Dobson. If you know that name, he started Focus on the Family, a ministry that is now worldwide that serves millions and millions of people, to assist them in what? Leading the next generation. So you don't miss it. Don't miss it. A godly next generation is going to be led by a godly generation now. That's you. Don't miss that. And as you lead them, the next one might even be someone that right now you don't expect. But keep seeing them in view of God's plans. Keep celebrating their place in God's kingdom. Keep reinforcing God's standards. And keep dropping to your knees and praying that God's work is going to be seen in them. Be a godly generation now. Let's pray. God, we thank you for the generation that's next. And as we sit in this church today, we know who we're thinking about. We're thinking about our kids. We're thinking about our grandkids. We're thinking about our nieces, our nephews. We're thinking about the kids next door. We're thinking about our neighbors, our friends. We're thinking about the kids that we teach at school, or that we serve at the daycare, or that we help in the gym. We're thinking of all these next generation kids. And these next generation kids, to be godly, need godly leaders now. And so I pray that we would recognize the high call in their life, that you've placed us in their life, to not just teach them, to not just get them out of the house eventually to do their own thing, to not just do what we think is appropriate in the world's eyes. God, we have a high calling from you, super high calling, to use this opportunity, whatever capacities and relationships, to lead them towards godliness. Because the generation that comes next needs godly leaders desperately. And so I pray that we won't miss that we won't miss our part in being involved, and that we won't push kids aside in our minds thinking that it's probably not going to be them. But we would pray for them knowing that you will use them. You will use them as we lead them towards godliness. I pray that we won't miss it. We pray these things in your name.